But when you actually look at it bottom up, so I look at it just in terms of the categories of spend that people are actually declaring through the processes I use for my surveys, I get a much higher average rate of inflation across all household groups. And when I actually talk to people through my one-on-one sessions, Tarek, I find exactly the same. People are saying, I don't understand. My costs of living are much, much higher than the official statistics. And I think I've got to say that the averaging that the ABS is using, maybe also some assumptions that they're actually applying, are actually pushing the numbers down. And of course, remember the CPI excludes the costs of mortgages and those sorts of things, which is a nutty thing anyway.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. So, what sort of rental inflation are you seeing in your data? Because I mean, that's quite a bit, quite a sort of big issue between the ABS and then those of private providers.
Yes, so I'm still seeing the rental inflation a lot stronger than the, say, the Catality's data. Remember that Catality is using the data quoted in the advertised rents, but
Yeah.
it doesn't include the perpetual increases that are being applied to existing renters at the moment. And some of those increases are still in the 10 to 15% range. So I don't think that that is actually flowing through into the publicly available data very well. And of course, the ABS tries to capture some of this, but you got to say, well, how do they know? How do they get the data for the rental sector other than looking at their survey information? Well, how good is their survey information? Bearing in mind, of course, that they came out recently and said that they're going to stop releasing some data because they don't trust their surveys. And I have this sort of weird echo of the of the US BLS disaster with the labour statistics there. Have we got a compass that's working? What can we say about the cost of living? What can we say about the employment or unemployment statistics? How reliable are these? And look, if you start asking that question, then you go around a very important rabbit hole which says, well, hang on a moment. If the Reserve Bank in Australia or the Federal Reserve in the US or the Bank of England is trying to make monetary policy decisions with rubbish data, what does that tell you?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, and I think that it's not just the monetary policy side of things either. I mean, as you mentioned, the ABS cancelled, well, not cancelled, postponed, I should say, those various data releases on household income, household spending, and housing costs, and etc., which leaves us basically flying blind with pandemic era data until the middle of 2027. Now, if I was in government and I had an interest in, pursuing the correct policy, then I would be wanting that data, to basically do whatever you have to get it on my desk, because I want to know what's happening with Aussie households. Although I guess if I was in charge, I could just ring you up and just be like, Martin, can you provide me with your data? Because I think, it would be, a whole lot better to have that.
Well, it's quite funny. I've had a number of data requests for the first time from various places, people trying to get a handle on some of this stuff and recognizing that the official information is just really, really patchy. And of course, it's even worse now because the ABS has now started doing their lending statistics every quarter, right?
Yeah.
Which is 1 month delayed. So it's 4 months behind reality. I mean, you can't do anything with that. So we're almost deliberately, I think, flying blind.
I think we're deliberately flying blind, but we're flying blind backwards using the rearview mirror. I think that's really the problem now, because, as you say, you've got this enormous lag in the data for housing finance now, and part of the problem is that we've arrived at a point here in Australia where, because savings balances have risen so much, the actual cash flow impact of interest rate cuts to households is actually significantly less than it has been in the past. And if you actually count the number of people who are just getting ahead on their mortgage and not reducing the payments, there's a fairly solid argument to be made that rate cuts are actually a negative impact on household cash flow. Because, yes, the households are getting ahead, but the only people who are seeing the benefit of that, aside from the household in terms of their mortgage balance, is the banks. So it's increasingly important to know how the wealth effect and how housing finance is impacting the economy. But if we're looking at that from an even greater lag than we normally are, then that becomes even more problematic, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's actually more worrying than that because, of course, there's also this distribution effect. So when you have your mortgage cohort, not all mortgage holders are actually in the same boat. There are some doing okay, there are others not doing okay. And the other point to make, of course, is that whilst the interest rate might be coming down a little, the average mortgage continues to grow because prices are still chasing higher. And so, again, the distributional aspect, and I think that it must include the aging of the mortgage agreements. So when did people buy? And what I'm seeing in my data is that there are quite a few people who had mortgages some time ago who are certainly well ahead and continuing to pay down their mortgage. But there's a whole tranche of newer homeowners who are still struggling to get into the market, who are leveraged up to the gills and are just struggling to be able to grab that mortgage, but they're not making extra repayments. Now, there's almost no information from the public sphere to show this distribution of different types of households with different, they may have a mortgage, but they are in very different situations. And I could actually take you through the same sort of arguments for those with savings and investments. Again, there are some people who are doing extremely well and are benefiting from the high returns from stock markets and the relatively good returns compared to history on deposits. But there's a whole bunch of other people who have very limited savings. And then you've got a whole bunch of other people who are neither, those with a mortgage nor those with savings, but they're very much the hand to mouth cohort, many of whom are renters. And I just don't think that the story that we're getting from the mainstream media or from the official statistics has the granularity to bring out these differences.
No, it doesn't, and I think that that's really disappointing because you get these. For a start, there's obviously the differences between different age demographics, and that is something that is borne out in some of the ABS data. It's very lagged, unfortunately. Like I believe the latest data that we have on this from the ABS is from 2022, middle of 2022. And that shows that basically young people today have seen no real spending since about 2004. So it's about 18 years of nothing. Now, if you add the CBA data on top of that, which is obviously it's not a perfect analog, it's not entirely apples with apples, but thematically they're similar. And then that looks even worse. But as you say, there are people who are getting ahead in those demographics still, even more so than perhaps was the case, say in this particular instance 20 years ago. So you've got the issue of, okay, there are some demographics who are going backwards, but then you've also got the fact that there are some in those demographics doing very well, but then there's perhaps the much of the rest of the demographic is doing quite badly. So you're just seeing this masking, I think, of the deterioration of outcomes for Australian households. And I think that's just I think it's sad that we're not more seriously examining that, both from a policy perspective and just from a sort of moral human perspective. Because if people out there are doing it tough, I think that they deserve to be heard. And I don't think that that's necessarily happening at the moment.